Hess, and this is the Crisis Report for September 3rd, 2018. We're summing up the crisis of imperialism, where we see threats of war, collapse, disarray, and injustice everywhere we look. We see the reality that almost half the world, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day, and at least 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. And every day, the gap between the oppressors and the oppressed, between the haves and the have-nots, gets greater and greater. So we want to make sense of this world, and today we're talking about the crisis of whiteness, something that we're going to be talking about a lot on this series. We're exploring the question, is whiteness a suicide cult? And it's based on an article in yesterday's New York Times. So we're going to be reading that and discussing it. As I said, we're attempting to make sense of this crisis abounding in the world around us through the lens of African internationalism, basically the point of view of the African working class and oppressed peoples of the world, seeing the world as it really is and as it is experienced through everybody else, through the experience of everybody else on this planet. And the conclusions that I come to in this report, in this crisis report, are not my own. They are from Chairman Omali Yeshitela, whose book I am using, called An Uneasy Equilibrium, The African Revolution versus Parasitic Capitalism, in which Chairman Omali Yeshitela sums up this crisis of imperialism. And that's why he uses the term uneasy equilibrium, because it's about the struggle between the past and the future, between the oppressor and the oppressed, between the forces of reaction and imperialism and the forces struggling for the freedom and liberation of oppressed peoples on this planet. And right now and in the past, it has been an uneasy equilibrium that goes back and forth. And what we're seeing is the deepening crisis of imperialism that the chairman has described, he's summed up, and we're seeing it play out, tipping the equilibrium of this planet into the hands of the oppressed and the colonized, where we will see victory of African and oppressed people. So this is the basis for the analysis that I'm going to be giving today. And I think that it's really, really important for us as white people to be able to begin to see the world through the eyes of the oppressed, instead of this whole mindset of white power and the oppressor. And just Chairman Omali Yeshitela goes to the source. He brings science. He lets us understand things in a way that we've never seen before, that we've never understood before. And everything he says, you just go, oh yes, how true. He turns reality right side up and shows us how much that our minds are captured by this imperialist system, and that we ourselves have lived off the backs of the enslavement of African people, the genocide of the indigenous people, and colonialism around the world. We've been complicit with it, but many of us want to end this relationship to white power and stand in a principled relationship to African people and oppressed peoples. And this shows the way that we can do this, and how much we still have to break from the thinking of white power and jump in to begin to see the world, as we said, as everybody else experiences it. So today, we're going to be reading from an article that was in the New York Times yesterday, and it was titled, quote, "The Religion of Whiteness Becomes a Suicide Cult." And sort of a subtitle was, "White Fear Stoked by Trump Could Put the World in Danger," by Pankaj Mishra. Again, the article in the New York Times. And of course, I have a problem with the very title of it, because the religion of whiteness is not new. And it has always put the majority of the people on the planet Earth in great danger, including genocide, murder, slaughter, and the theft of their resources and the demeaning of their culture and them as human beings. So this article begins, quote, "White men unquote, an obscure Australian academic named Charles Henry Pearson predicted in his 1893 book called National Life and Character, a Forecast. Again, this is from 1893. He said white men would be elbowed and hustled and perhaps even thrust aside by people they had long regarded as their inferiors, quote, black and yellow races. China in particular would be a major threat, he said. Pearson, prone to terrors of racial extinction while living in a settler colony in an Asian neighborhood, thought it was imperative to defend the last part of the world in which, quote, the higher races can live and increase freely for the higher civilization, unquote. His prescriptions for racial self-defense thunderously echoed around the white Anglosphere, the community of men with shared historical ties to Britain. Theodore Roosevelt, who held a complacent 19th century faith buttressed by racist pseudoscience that non-white peoples were, quote, hopelessly inferior, reported to Pearson, quote, the great effect of his book among, quote, all our men here in Washington. The article goes on. In years that follow, politicians and pundits in Britain and its settler colonies of Australia, Canada, and the United States would jointly forge an identity geopolitics of the, quote, higher races. Today, it has reached its final and most desperate phase, with existential fears about endangered white power feverishly circulating once again between the core and the periphery of the greatest modern empire. The fundamental question of our time, is quoted by President Trump last year, is whether the West has the will to survive. Trump said that in a speech hailed by the British journalist Douglas Murray, the Canadian columnist Mark Stein, and the American editor Rich Lowry. So I just want to stop for a minute and say again, this is a very academic article that obscures what is a very simple reality. And just first of all, Trump's tweet harks back to a 2001 book by Patrick Buchanan called The Death of the West, How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Culture and Civilization, which Chairman Omali Yeshitela has cited in many writings and speeches. And the fact is that this author, Mr. Mishra, leaves out a lot of history here. And, it sort of jumps into the middle of the movie, as the chairman says. It didn't, this galvanization of white power and white nationalism didn't begin in 1893. It didn't begin in this era. It is part of the DNA of the U.S., of capitalism and imperialism. It leads out a lot. And so, as Chairman Omali Yeshitela teaches us, we must start with the reality that African, Asian, and indigenous peoples were violently and viciously assaulted, conquered, enslaved, demeaned to a status below human beings, and colonized by Europeans since about the 15th century. Colonialism, by the way, is the domination of a whole people by a foreign and alien state power and people for profit, for economic benefit. And this is what the entire world basically has been colonized by Europe, by white power, by capitalism. And this created the birth of capitalism itself. It is not a capitalism gone bad at a certain period. This is how it started. I also want to say that this question that he refers to as the Anglosphere is very strange, because it is not just English-speaking people of Europe that are doing this. That the slave trade, imperialism was carried out by the Spanish, the Portuguese, Of course, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Germans came in late, but they got some. They got into Africa. They started colonizing. And so it isn't about, as the chairman makes very clear, it isn't about British. It isn't about Anglosphere. It's the identity of Europe, of a European consciousness and identity as white, built on the backs of the assault on Africa and everybody else on this planet. And, you know, if we use terms like Anglosphere, then we're not fighting, there's no way to fight an idea of English-speaking white people. But when we talk about imperialism, we talk about the U.S. government, we talk about capitalism, there is the ability to fight and defeat a political and economic system with state power that upholds it, that can be defeated, and it must be defeated. That is a world economic system with state power that exists on a pedestal of the oppression of African and oppressed peoples of the world. So this is what gave Europe and white people the wealth and power to be imperialists, to dominate the world, to have some white guy sitting in Australia. And he doesn't even mention the fact that Australia was stolen from the indigenous people there, who are African people, who were just genocide carried out against them, who are still being terrorized, locked up into prisons, their children stolen from them and put into horrible concentration camps called boarding or residential schools. The idea came from inside the United States, which is what the U.S. did to indigenous children here. So these conditions are still going on. Colonialism still exists. And, you know, the chairman, I just want to make this point, and that I think that is really important. Chairman Omali-Yeshitela says in this book, every white aspiration and dream, every expectation for happiness and a good life, from a successful marriage to a secure future for their children, requires drone strikes in Pakistan, police murders and mass imprisonment in the African colonies and barrios of the U.S., and starvation and forced displacement of the oppressed throughout the world. The chairman just read this morning on #OmaliTaughtMe. You can watch him every Sunday morning from 8 to 10 a.m. as he is reading his current book, his current political report called The Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment. It's brilliant. It's amazing to see it. And we have to go to the source to understand this. The person who has been analyzing this from the point of view of the African working class for over 50 years and struggling to make the liberation of Africa and African people a reality. So Pearson, this white guy in Australia in 1893 who predicted these conditions, was right. African, Asian, and indigenous peoples everywhere are going to resist. They are resisting. They have resisted since the very first time a European set foot on their land and began to rape, to pillage, to steal them, to steal their resources, to do all the things that colonialism has done and continues to do, and which is the basis for the foundation of capitalism in this world. So, so that they're going to continue to struggle until they are free. And this is the cause of this crisis of imperialism that Chairman Omali-Yeshitela has summed up. So I just want to continue a little bit with this article where Mr. Mishra is saying, more recently, Mr. Trump tweeted falsely about large-scale killing, quote-unquote, of white farmers in South Africa, a preoccupation deepened by the Rupert Murdoch's media of white supremacists around the world. And I just want to say that it may be false at this time, but I will say that African people are going to be free, and that there is an African revolution that's going on, and African people in Southern Africa, in Kenya, and any place else where white people have stolen their land and gotten the resources and are settler colonizers on at the expense of African people, they are going to have their land taken away from them. African people are going to fight for what is theirs. This is their land. These are their resources. They were betrayed by the African National Congress and even Nelson Mandela, because the conditions are worse than they were under apartheid in Southern Africa today. And that more white people own land than ever before, and African workers are they live in shanty towns, in corrugated tin shacks on their own land, struggling for their own resources. So Africans are resisting. So I just want to continue with this article that was in the New York Times today by Mr. Mishra. It's saying, in the motherlands of democracy, rather than in fascist Europe, racial hierarchies first define the modern world. So let me read that again. It is in the motherlands of democracy, rather than in fascist Europe, that racial hierarchies first define the modern world. I just want to say, this is a point made by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Go to the source, because he doesn't even explain that or what that means in this context. He just throws it in there. But exactly, this is what the chairman is saying. Because first of all, Chairman Omali Yeshitela makes it very clear that for the ability for Europe to have democracy, as we read in the statement before from him, that it requires the suffering and oppression and theft of the land and resources of African and oppressed people around the world. So yes, it was born, it was here that this is in the DNA of imperialism and capitalism taking place in the European and US democracy for white people that comes at the expense of everybody else on the planet. And so the article continues that it is also where a last-ditch and potentially calamitous battle to preserve them is being fought today. To understand the rapid mainstreaming of white supremacism in English-speaking liberal democracies today, we must examine the experience of unprecedented global migration and racial mixing in the Anglosphere in the late 19th century. Countries such as the United States and Australia, where, as Theodore Roosevelt wrote admiringly in 1897, quote, democracy with the clear instinct of race selfishness saw the race foe and kept out the dangerous alien. Well, the dangerous alien, the African indigenous people were already here. In this country, the democracies of Europe brought African people here. This is how the democracy was built. Europe was under feudalism when it attacked Africa. This is where democracy came from. And it was here inside the United States that imperialism and capitalism seized African people, turned them into commodities, and forced them, kidnapped them, brought them as commodities into the United States to be forced to labor for free for many hundreds of years. And this was the basis for the wealth and power of the US. So the point is that the chairman is always making is that there is one capitalist system. It has two faces in the world. It's not that Africa and parts of Asia and where indigenous people are in the Americas is not experiencing capitalism. They are. This is their experience of capitalism, that the wealth and democracy inside of Europe and North America for white people requires the poverty and suffering of African, indigenous, and oppressed peoples around the world. So it is not new. It did not start in 1897. It started from the very first time that a European assaulted Africa and began stealing human beings. We have to remember this. Why is this the footnote? This is the essential question. And again, it is Chairman Omali Yeshitela who makes this. Go to the source. Go to the source. Don't take some kind of academic academic reinterpretation, because this guy is taking the words and the understanding from the chairman, but he doesn't quote it. He puts it into his own imperialist-dominated thought that he's putting out here. So what we are saying, again, this guy is saying, Mishra is saying, rapid mainstreaming of white supremacism in English-speaking liberal democracies today. No, this has been going on since day one, since capitalism was born. And this ideology of white superiority and white nationalism, of racism itself, as Chairman Omali Shatella says, he's proven in this book that it's the ideological underpinning of capitalism and the justification for the slaughter, rape, and pillage of others. But the conditions faced by African and oppressed peoples around the world, but even inside the borders of the United States, is colonialism itself. That's why there's two Americas. That's why there's the colonizer and the colonized. We exist side by side, but everybody knows that there are two realities in this country, in the courts, in the systems, in the prisons, in wealth and power, in so many ways that we can go over. There's two Americas. White people experience one thing, and African people experience hell in the schools, in the prisons, in poverty, in the face of the police. At every possible aspect of life is colonialism inside the borders of the United States. So I also want to say that it is this colonial domination, and Chairman makes this point as well. It's so many amazing points in this book. Please go to it, get it. He says that it is the colonial domination of African and others that gave all Europeans an identity and sense of sameness as white. When white people assaulted African and others, we began to identify ourselves as a whole as white. And this is even what gave Europe an identity. It's Europe as a whole, because all of Europe participated, or at very minimum benefited from European imperialism that created capitalism, as the chairman says. And I also want to make a point, because he's saying that this was carried out by white men. Yes, it was, but it was carried out and supported by white women too. And, so I'll talk about that again in a minute. So to go back to Mishra's article in yesterday's New York Times, he said, this, quote, race selfishness was sharpened in the late 19th century, as the elites of the higher races struggled to contain disaffection generated by the traumatic change of globalization. What? What does that mean? What are we talking about? Of course, there was disaffection generated by what? I don't know, what this means, globalization. First of all, capitalism from the very beginning is a global system. You've read about the so-called triangular trade that linked Europe, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere, where Africans were brought to. You know that as early as the 16th century, that India was raped and pillaged, and that genocide was carried out in the Philippines, and that, that all the way from the beginning, China was attacked. In the 1840s, Vietnam was conquered. Southeast Asia, this was the world system that imperialism was bought on. So I don't know what he's talking about. What is globalization? But he's saying that the loss of jobs and livelihoods amid rapid economic growth and intensified movements of capital, goods, and labor. For fearful ruling classes, political order depended on their ability to forge an alliance between, as Hannah Arendt wrote, so now he has to bring in Hannah Arendt, capital and mob, between rich and powerful whites and those rendered superfluous by industrial capitalism. Exclusion or degradation of non-white peoples seemed one way of securing dignity for those marginalized by economic and technological shifts. So what he's saying is that what we're seeing now is this deal between the imperialist ruling class and the capitalist ruling class and the masses of white people who have been workers. And that it was in this process that the degradation of non-white peoples seemed one way of securing dignity for those marginalized by economic and technological shifts. Now wait, because first of all, this has been going on for a long time. And if you really want to look at history, you have to go back to, as Chairman Omali Yeshitela shows us, in 1848, when there was near revolution in Europe, when white workers were in upheaval, basically saying to the capitalist rulers, give us some of the stolen resources that you have amassed. And they were struggling for rights, they wanted higher pay, they wanted better working conditions, and all of this comes at the expense of oppressed peoples, because it was in 1848 when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and even though it was at the height of the trade in African people, it was at the peak of the slaughter of the indigenous people. This stuff was in the newspapers in Europe. Everybody knew about this, that it was at the theft of the land. It was at the time of the Opium War that Britain was waging against China in order to control and colonize China. This was in the newspaper. But as Chairman Omali Yeshitela tells us, this is where the resources and the labor to get the stolen resources came from. It came from oppressed and colonized peoples around the world that created jobs for European workers, that created the pay raises, that enabled white people to change from white workers to the middle class. It created the white working class itself. And this is the analysis that the chairman gives, because nobody talks about that. So this is when, if anything, a deal was consolidated to enable sectors of the white working class to be able to clearly share in the benefits stolen by the colonial domination and enjoyed historically by the white ruling class. And even prior to that, when poor white people came from Europe with nothing, came to the U.S. recognizing that the ladder to success is stepping on the backs of enslaved Africans and stealing the land of the indigenous people. So this deal had long been made way before this period of, quote, globalization. Imperialism and capitalism were a global system. So I just want to go on a little bit more. And this article continues, it's saying if right-wing Australian politicians were among the first to mainstream a belligerent white nationalism, the periodicals and television channels of Rupert Murdoch have worked overtime to preserve the alliance between capital and mob in the Anglosphere. So again, right-wing Australian politicians, what about George Washington? What about Thomas Jefferson? What about Andrew Jackson, who's on the $20 bill in the United States? They were overt white nationalists. They were slave owners. They were perpetrators of genocide against the indigenous people. It goes all the way back. It's not new. But Mishra continues, not surprisingly, these chieftains of white settler colonies are fierce cultural warriors. They're all affiliated with private donors who build platforms where political correctness, Islam, and feminism are excoriated, the facts of injustice and inequality denied, chest thumped about a superior but sadly imperiled Western civilization, and a fraternal sympathy extended to Israel, the world's last active settler colonialist project. Well, first of all, I want to say that feminism is not excoriated by white power. It is upheld by white power, and feminism is a white power movement that struggles to enable white women to equally share also in the plunder and the stolen loot from African and oppressed peoples around the world. And that Israel is an active settler colonizer project, but is not the last one, because the U.S. itself is a settler colonizer country, and so is Canada, so is South Africa, so is Australia. What made this guy that was 120 years ago living in Australia as a settler colonizer, what changed that? Nothing. The conditions are still the same for the indigenous people of Australia. So Mishra continues to say, emotional incontinence rather than style or wit marks such gilded networks of white power. So is he saying that it would be better if they were witty? I don't think so. For the Anglosphere, quote unquote, that we're continuing with Mishra, originally forged and united by the slave trade and colonialism, it's in its terminal crisis today. Yes, this is the thesis of the chairman, but this is way at the end of the article. He suddenly throws this in. Again, go to the source. He is taking this from the understandings of African internationalism and Chairman Omali Yeshitela. But read it yourself. This is not the context that he was putting it in. So this article ends with Mishra saying, whiteness denoted, as W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, quote, the ownership of the earth forever and ever. And I would just note, and I'm not going to go into it right now, that Chairman Omali Yeshitela has a lot of political differences that he discusses in this book with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was critical in waging a movement to smash the movement of Marcus Garvey. He elicited the U.S. government and white leftists and other kinds of forces to attack Garvey, and basically forced him into imprisonment when he was imprisoned by the U.S. government, and eventually into exile. So I'm just making that point. And again, you can read all about that here in this book. So Mishra continues, but many descendants of the landlords of the earth find themselves besieged both at home and abroad, their authority as overlords, policemen, and interpreters of the globe increasingly challenged. Yes, this is the crisis of imperialism. This is the result of the resistance of oppressed people, which, as the chairman is saying, are becoming the subjects of history, not the objects. That they are overturning the white narrative that has been placed on them and telling their own story and giving their own aspirations for freedom and liberation and moving on it and fighting for it. And it's going to be a reality. Again, these are ideas taken from Chairman Omali Yeshitela from this book, but are not cited here. And obviously, this person does not have the ability to put it in the context that Chairman Omali Yeshitela does. So he continues that, let me come to the end here because I want to wrap up, but he's saying that a century ago, the mere suspicion of being thrust aside by black and yellow people sparked apocalyptic visions of race suicide. Today, quote, the preponderance of China that Pearson predicted is becoming a reality, and the religion of whiteness increasingly resembles a suicide cult. Yes, it does. As white people are in despair because they see the fact that imperialism is in a crisis and that their position on the pedestal of white power is being threatened along with imperialism. So he ends by saying that Mr. Trump's trade wars, sanctions, border walls, deportations, denaturalizations, and other 11th hour battles seem to push us all closer to, quote, the terrible probability. James Baldwin once outlined that the rulers of, quote, the higher races struggling to hold on to what they have stolen from their captives and unable to look into the mirror will precipitate a chaos throughout the world, which, if it does not bring life on this planet to an end, will bring about a racial war such as the world has never seen, unquote. So suddenly he is quoting James Baldwin, And James Baldwin, speaking in the 60s, was talking about the massive upheaval of oppressed and colonized peoples around the world struggling against colonialism and against the white power and U.S. imperialism. And the difference between this quote and Chairman Omali Yeshitela, again, is that Chairman Omali Yeshitela does not believe that he does believe that there will be this massive upheaval, and this is what is happening, but there will not be the end of life on this planet. In fact, it will be the beginning of life on this planet. It will be the end of a system that is built on death and rape and suffering and slaughter and genocide and every horrible thing, as the chairman says, that white people could do to anybody else, that humans could do to another human being. That system will be overturned, and the system that Chairman Omali Yeshitela is fighting for is a system in which all human beings have the ability to live, no one at the expense of anyone else. He is struggling against all forms of oppression. He is saying that all human beings must live, and that the only future for this planet is for imperialism to die and for African, indigenous, and oppressed peoples to have power over their lives. So, I just want to call on you to watch Chairman Omali Yeshitela every Sunday morning from 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern. You can go to hashtag Omali Taught Me, the Burning Spear newspaper, YouTube channel. You can look on Facebook. You will see this, and you will be able to see Chairman Omali Yeshitela himself talking about the crisis of imperialism and what it's going to take to overturn it once and for all. I just want to say that I am the chair of the African People's Solidarity Committee, which is white people under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, organizing other white people for reparations to African people and to stand in solidarity with the right of African people to their homeland of Africa and the return of their stolen resources, which is what the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International is building for all around the world among African people wherever they've been forcibly dispersed, and which is fighting for and will win. Our future as white people is not in a suicide cult of white power. It doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be this identification with white power. We don't have to see the world this way. We don't have to be part of it. And it's not even in the liberal ideological imperialism of the white left, but it can be freed up under the leadership of the African Revolution, which puts us in touch and lets us build a principled relationship to African people everywhere to overturn our history of violence, of terror that we ourselves voluntarily have lynched, we've burned, we've tortured African people, we have picked up the gun against the indigenous people. We owe reparations. This system owes reparations. This is a powerful and a very positive stance. It has changed my life. It has let me see that there's a whole world out there that I can abandon. Our historical relationship as colonizer of the world, as colonizer in the face of the colonized, of the African and oppressed peoples here inside the borders of the United States and around the world. So our future as white people is in reparations to African people, to indigenous people. We're dying. There will not be whiteness in a few years. We're not even reproducing ourselves, and the mortality rate of white people is soaring. I'm going to talk about this more and more in the next several episodes of the Crisis Report. There's not going to be whiteness because African people are going to be free, and whiteness was born off the assault on Africa. And when African people are free, when indigenous people are free, borders will be gone. The concept of whiteness and race will be gone because African people are not a race. They're a nation of people struggling for their own land and their self-government and self-determination. For us, we can join this, but under the organized solidarity, under the leadership of the African working class, the African People's Socialist Party. I urge you to join this. Don't commit suicide. Don't become a drug addict. Don't become an alcoholic. Don't get Alzheimer's disease. Join the future. You will be forever young. You will be able to feel this incredible connection that's principled to the people on the planet Earth. We have a future, and it's there. So I'm saying that if you'd like to give reparations, you can contribute to the work and project of the African People's Socialist Party called the Black Power Blueprint. You can go to blackpowerblueprint.org, go to blackpowerblueprint.org and give resources today. Turn it over to the African working class, the Black Power Blueprint. You can also find out a lot more at that website, because this project is bringing economic and political power to the African working class on the north side of St. Louis, right here today in St. Louis, Missouri. So please go find out more about this. And you can find out more about and you can join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the mass white organization under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, at uhurusolidarity.org. So go there and join. And go to burningspearmarketplace.com to purchase this book, The Uneasy Equilibrium. Go to the source, go to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, find out what he really said. It's so easy to read. It will give you so much clarity and a sense of hope that we can be part of this world. This organization is changing the world. It is going to be a world of justice, peace, nobody at the expense of anybody else. And finally, I want to say, to find out about the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party that is taking place October 6th to the 12th in St. Louis, Missouri, go to apspcongress.org. So that's it for today. See you next week, and we'll be talking again about this crisis of imperialism. Uhuru and unity through reparations.